This happened several years ago in early October. I had 2 weeks off work and had taken a trip down to a cabin in the hills outside of my city. It was an Airbnb that was far out, which was perfect because I wanted to spend a few days camping. Well, I drove 2 hours to the cabin and got there in the afternoon. It was really nice and quiet. No other cabins or buildings were in sight. It was just the woods going all around. I set my things inside and looked through the rooms, but it was nothing special. It had a very cozy, old-fashioned feel to it, not something I was a huge fan of, but it was a nice change of environment for a vacation. The rest of that night and the following few days went by with nothing of interest. I spent my time relaxing, sitting outside in the cold fall weather for most of the days and spending the nights inside by the fireplace. It was on the 5th day, though, that I set out with my camping gear. I wasn't sure how long exactly I was going to camp for, but planned for 2 to 3 nights. There were a couple trails nearby that I was aware of from planning ahead, but only one of them actually connected to the cabin. To keep things simple, I chose to just take that one so I could leave straight from the cabin and not have to drive anywhere. I walked for at least 3 or 4 hours before I found the spot. I was happy with this. Was the only clearing I'd found aside from the trail itself, but something would just feel uncomfortable about camping directly on the path. It was closing in on night time already, so I got my tent up and started a fire. As it got darker, I put on my heavy sweater and jacket. With the cold really starting to come in, I sat out by the fire for an hour, eating up a quick meal and waiting for myself to get more sleepy. But at some point while I was sitting there, my eyes caught sight of something, a figure walking out in the woods. I watched as they walked through the dark, no flashlight or anything, and disappeared in the distance. The only light in the woods was my campfire aside from the dim moonlight, so whoever was out there had to have seen me. It was so strange the way they were walking, though, just being out here in the woods with no light and not even following the trail. It made me feel really unnerved enough to think about taking the long walk back to the cabin, but I knew it wasn't safe to go out this late into the night. I stayed on watch for a half hour, checking everywhere. Disappeared in the distance. The only light in the woods was my campfire aside from the dim moonlight, so whoever was out there had to have seen me. It was so strange the way they were walking, though, just being out here in the woods with no light and not even following the trail. It made me feel really unnerved enough to think about taking the long walk back to the cabin, but I knew it wasn't safe to go out this late into the night. I stayed on watch for a half hour, checking everywhere, but not seeing any more signs of the person. After a while I started getting tired, so I flattened the fire and let it burn out. But just as the glow faded into ashes, I heard footsteps coming from the left of the campsite. My eyes widened, looking into the woods and trying to force my eyes to adjust to the dark, but all I could see was a few feet ahead. The footsteps got louder, coming toward the campsite, getting close enough for me to think that they had to be just outside of my sight, but not seeing any more signs of the person. After a while I started getting tired, so I flattened the fire and let it burn out. But just as the glow faded into ashes, I heard footsteps coming from the left of the campsite. My eyes widened, looking into the woods and trying to force my eyes to adjust to the dark, but all I could see was a few feet ahead. The footsteps got louder, coming toward the campsite, getting close enough for me to think that they had to be just outside of my sight. But then they walked slightly off, staying in the dark and passing by, then continuing to walk away. They never stopped or did anything to show that they acknowledged that I was there, but the chances of them being out here at the exact place I was just impossible to be a coincidence. Once the footsteps were gone, I took out my flashlight and disassembled my tent, packing my things and going back to the trail. It wasn't ideal, but I could sense that something was off about whatever was going on. I walked quickly, keeping my flashlight on the trail and trying to keep myself calm. The woods were so quiet, though, just adding to the eeriness of the situation I'd found myself in. Although I had my doubts, I made it back to the cabin. It was still well into the night, and after walking so much that day on no sleep, I passed out on the couch just minutes after getting inside. My mind was so foggy I wasn't even really thinking about the person in the woods anymore. Being a 4-hour walk from where I'd seen them, I didn't feel I really had reason to be scared anymore. As I was passed out, though, I groggy woke up to a strange sound, something on the other side of the cabin, like wood scraping against the walls. My eyes shot open and I whipped my head around to face the back of the room, seeing the window slowly being pushed open by a man outside. His eyes immediately shifted onto me as I stood up. Then he dropped the window and ran away. By the time I gotten 4-hour walk from where I'd seen them, I didn't feel I really had reason to be scared anymore. As I was passed out, though, I groggy woke up to a strange sound, something on the other side of the cabin, like wood scraping against the walls. My eyes shot open and I whipped my head around to face the back of the room, seeing the window slowly being pushed open by a man outside. His eyes immediately shifted onto me as I stood up. Then he dropped the window and ran well into the cover of the woods. I got everything together and left the cabin, driving to a hotel in a nearby town. Obviously, I don't know who that man was or what he was doing out there. Clearly he'd followed me, though, and tried to get inside the cabin while I was sleeping. If he had, there's no saying what would have happened. This happened last fall. It was toward the end of the season, closer to winter, and where I live it gets pretty cold and even snow sometimes in October. I've been doing food delivery for the past 3 years and was working on this night. It was around 1 p.m. and lightly snowing outside. It was one of the first snowfalls, so people must have been skittish to go out. I was one of few cars driving around, but a lot of orders were coming in. Pretty much as soon as I'd finish one, another one would pop up. After driving around everywhere until almost 1 a.m., I took up one last order. The snow was starting to pick up and I was just getting a little tired. I drove through the McDonald's that they'd ordered from and picked up the food, then set in the directions to the house. It was close, about 10 minutes away, but I didn't consider the direction it was in before accepting the order. It was opposite from where I lived and I was already a good 25 minutes from home, so it was going to be a long drive home. Afterward, annoyed at myself, I turned out of the parking lot and onto the road. The plow trucks still weren't out yet, probably because they weren't expecting this much downfall, but my SUV was usually good in the snow, so I wasn't that nervous. While I was driving, I noticed the road I was heading down was about to leave the main area of town. I checked the map again and it said it was this way, but it was just a very unusual route. I didn't even know any house were down there, because the only reason people take the road is to get to the highway that leads out of state. I went down for a few minutes, seeing only street lights and trees, until I came up to the turn. It was a single small street leading off the road. I slowed down, being more careful, since this street was smaller and had trees lined up right beside it, so sliding off would make a really terrible night. As I made my way down, I saw a few long driveways leading to faint lights in the trees far out. Before I reached the driveway I was to turn down, it looks like all the others. I slowly drove through the driveway until I made it to the house. It was medium-sized and older, completely covered in snow. Nothing looked too notable about it, really. The only interesting thing was that it was out here in the middle of some forest. I parked out front and got the bag, then started walking up to the door. The snow was thicker than I would have liked, soaking my shoes and even the lower legs of my pants. When I got up to the porch, I knocked and started to set the bag down, but almost immediately the door swung open. I looked up, seeing a large man in a winter jacket. His face was pale, like he'd just been outside in the cold. "Old Hi, I got your order right here," I said, holding the bag up. After a moment the man stepped back and opened the door wider. "You can set it down right over there." He lifted his arm and pointed toward what I assume was the kitchen the way he said it made me feel like I had to, but I knew it was a horrible idea to go in there. I looked at the man's hands, seeing he wasn't holding anything, so it really didn't make any sense for me to do anything other than hand him the bag. "Sorry, but I really have to get going," I said nervously, holding the bag up. Again the man's face dropped into a frown, then he suddenly slammed the door shut, still holding the bag up, and just a bit shocked by what was happening, I set it down on the porch and quickly started walking back to my car. But just as I got past the front yard, I heard something from behind me. I turned around, realizing it was from somewhere on the other side of the house. It could have been a back door or something, but was too muffled to hear clearly. Getting creeped out, I walked quicker and got in my car. I switched it on, and right as I looked up I saw the man coming around the side of his house and making his way quickly over to my car. He had something in his hands. It almost looked like rope, but there was something else that I wasn't able to make out. I suddenly felt my heartbeat spike and adrenaline take over my body. I started going in reverse, trying my hardest to go quick while also not getting stuck in the snow. The man got close, probably just a few feet away, before my car was able to grip the road and start picking up some speed. I backed up through the whole driveway, seeing the man eventually stop and watch slowly fading into the dark. As I backed up into the street, I don't know what he was doing. Honestly, the whole thing was just terrifying and confusing enough to make me not even want to think about it. I still do food deliveries, but I'm far more cautious, and most of the time I don't even knock on the doors anymore. I just drop the food on the porch and leave. Had I stayed any longer that night or had entered the house, who knows what would have happened to